Coming up on Zestology today, you've probably read some of his books. Cal Newport is on the podcast. Also, WhatsApp pet hates, emails with one word, messages that say, "How are you?" They take time to reply. Takes no time for the sender to send it. Getting in touch with our Paleolithic brains and loads more. Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a fuck about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality, and motivation. Thank you for all your great feedback after last week's podcast trial. Appreciate it. If you haven't got in touch with me yet, I'd love to know what you think. It's a new podcast format which features slightly more of my journey, but still with some big interviews like I have today with Cal Newport. I mean, he is excellent in the terms of distraction and focus. He's such a big name, and he is coming up on the podcast later today, but I'm going to try and continue with that format, and it's a work in progress. So you'll find over the next few weeks things will gradually switch over to the new format. So welcome back. Thanks for listening to Zestology again. Typically, some drilling has just started next door to my spare room, so I hope you can't hear that too much. Forgive me for starting with a little bit of news about my new book, When Life is a Bit Meh, You Need Energy. Amazon featured it in a deal over the weekend last week, and it was downloaded 2,339 times in 3 days. So that's exciting, isn't it? It's all about energy, biohacking, and NLP. If you haven't read it, it's now not on a featured deal anymore on Amazon, but it is obviously on Amazon in paperback and ebook. And it's been out about a month now, and it's going pretty well. So really enjoying that, and would love you to take a look if you would like to. Before I get onto today's podcast interview with Cal, I've been playing with a rice hack recently. I originally heard about this from Bulletproof, from the Bulletproof cookbook, and then my friend Ryan at LiveVite on Instagram told me about it, and it's all about cooled rice, cooked rice, and then you cool it. And it's something I've been playing with fairly recently, and I'm fascinated by this because basically it's a way to stop your carbs and your glucose spiking and crashing so much. It's a way of having carbs without feeling guilty about it. Works like this. You cook some rice with 3 tablespoons of coconut oil. In fact, I've only been putting 1 or 2 in, but whatever you've got. Then you drain it and you cool it in the fridge. And an in-depth study found that rice cooled this way produces a much smaller spike in blood sugar. It's mad, isn't it? Because what happens is you cook the rice, then it cools, and when you cool it, resistant starch is created. So you can leave it for up to 12 hours in the fridge, and then you eat it. In theory, this means you won't get the carb crashes you might get from normal rice. And the thing is, it also tastes great. You can eat it, you can warm it up again, or you can eat it cool. And the idea is that resistant rice is there and good. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, I sent the study out. But I mean, it's quite a detailed study that they did on this. Cooked and cooled rice produces this resistant starch, which means you just don't get a glucose spike. The big question, does it work? And I can't honestly say whether it does or not. I'm not wearing a glucose monitor, so I need to put one of them on and test it out with that. But if you've been trying this cooked and cooled rice hack and you want to get a lower carb option in terms of your evening meal or something like that, try this and let me know how you go. Okay, on to today's podcast interview. It'll change the way you use your phone, your desktop, and your WhatsApps. Email is making people miserable. It has a mind of its own and it's stopping people getting on with their working lives. And Cal Newport is here to save us from that. Cal is a celebrated author. I have 3 of his books here at home. And I mean, just some of the stats that he was telling me, and I was also reading in his book before we spoke. The average person checks their email 75 times a day. For heavy users, it can be 400 times per day. The average worker sends 126 emails per day. That is 1 every 4 minutes. And the constant interruptions are affecting the way that our ancient Paleolithic brains work. And I find for WhatsApps, it's an absolute killer. I mean, right now I'm recording this podcast and I have got a WhatsApp tab open. And if there's a little 1 that appears by the WhatsApp, I'll get distracted and I'll stop what I'm doing. 3 working hours per day are being lost to emails and WhatsApps. Valuable hours that could be spent achieving a better work-life balance. And 2 of my pet annoyances are emails with 1 words, sort of thoughts, question mark. Yeah, it takes time to reply, but no time for the sender to send. And a WhatsApp that just says, how are you? Again, takes time to reply, but takes no time for the sender to send. Cal Newport turns his mind to all this. He is an outstanding podcast guest, and here he is. The demands on our time from technology and the demands on our focus just seem to grow exponentially every year.
Well, it's probably true. Now, of course, I'm sure everyone feels busier than the generation before, but I think we have a good standing on which to make this complaint, because the way technology has developed over the last, let's say, 15 years really has had a profound impact on the human experience.
And I mean, I'm really looking forward to getting onto your new book and talking about a world without email. But it's just occurred to me while you were saying that I've had a theory really over the last year that with all the stresses of the pandemic, I think the fact that we're all so connected to news and the news cycle, and I'm a journalist, I work in the news cycle, and yet I feel like it's very sensitizing being connected to the news so much, isn't it?
It can't be super helpful. I think this pandemic year, if you had a choice, if you could go back in time and say, what if, I didn't consume news and you would just keep me updated once a week. Like, here's what you need to know. Like, here's what the current restrictions are. Like, you can't do this, the pub's closed, whatever. And that was it. And you went through the whole last year not being plugged into beat by beat arguments on Twitter, not being plugged into doom and gloom headlines, right? We would have been so much happier. No one looks back and is like, man, I'm really glad that I read those 35 op-eds and front page articles about how the variants were about to sneak in through the back door and steal my jewelry. I mean, who's really better off for having followed the news that closely?
And you get such an instant reminder of the effect of it when, for instance, I found it very stressful at the start of the pandemic. The news was just so dire and none of us knew quite what was going to happen, whether it was going to be 20% of us dying or 2%, which is obviously bad, but I remember avoiding news as much as possible and then having the radio on and a news bulletin would come on and I'd immediately get that same kind of feeling in the pit of my stomach. That's what happens, isn't it?
It's very stressful. I agree. I was in a similar situation where I would try to really consolidate my news consumption. Like, this is it. I'll check in on what's going on. I'll try to end on a positive note, like what's a good development, what's something that's happening good. But you would get just these little hits. And you're right, the radio, or the thing that would keep getting me is my iPhone. I would be trying to swipe over. And I guess if you swipe too far, it shows you Apple News. Oh. And that's what would always get me. I was like, I don't need to know about this. You swipe too far and it's like, coronavirus outbreaks everywhere. And you hit that, it's physical. Like that little punch in the gut, you really feel it, which gives us this broader point, which is technologies are not these neutral tools like a hammer that some are better than others. They can be deeply enmeshed into our emotional, subjective experience. So it's something to really take carefully.
Yeah. Now, I find this quite kind of consoling that you are one of the world's, you are the world's go-to authority on issues of kind of focus and distraction and so forth. If you're struggling with it, then I feel better about myself. So you do struggle as well, do you?
Well, I found the pandemic to be struggling. I mean, I think it helped that I don't use social media. I think it helps that I'm relatively low news consumption. I actually use a paper newspaper, that I that I read in the morning. So if even someone, I turn it around. If even someone like me found that I was seeing enough that was making me really upset, I extrapolated that to think, man, this must be what a lot of people's life is like, even in much more normaler times. If you were constantly plugged into this flow of hyper arousing information that's been algorithmically optimized, I feel like I got a taste of what a lot of people really experience in terms of their encounter with information throughout the day.
Yeah, it's so hard, isn't it? Because so many of us now actually, this is nicely kind of segues onto your new work. So many of us are actually reliant on technology and reliant on being plugged in to do our work.
Well, this is where we get into trouble, is trying to understand the difference between, oh, here's a technology that I need to use for X, and this technology is now playing role Z in my life, and that is troublesome. That is a problem, right? And this is the problem you have with almost any of these debates. You say, social media in my life, for example, is creating a lot of negative externalities. Someone else can come along and say, yes, but here's one way people use social media that's good. And keeping both those ideas in our mind at the same time. Or like my new book, I'm glad email exists because I hate the fax machine. I also am devastated by trying to keep up with my email inbox. Like, both of these things can be true at the same time. And figuring out how to pull apart these seemingly contradictory observations is really critical right now, because otherwise we're not going to successfully navigate all these new innovations.
Yeah, because your book, about deep work, resonated with me so much, and I've thought about that often since I read that book. And today I feel like I need to chat to you today, Cal, because the last few months I've been writing my book, and I've really enjoyed the process of deep work. It's a very enjoyable process once you can put all the kind of the shallow mind stuff to one side and do that. But the problem is, there's so much work to be done that's not deep work. So now the book is finished, and I've spent all day kind of fighting fires, answering emails back and forth with things that aren't going quite right and books that aren't formatted in quite the right way. There's no deep work at all, but it does need to be done.
Well, yeah, this is the reality of modern work. There is deep work and there is shallow work, but I'll say the thing that I was pointing out, let's say in my new book, is what is killing us metaphorically is not so much that there is non-deep work to do. And in fact, there's a lot of professions in which you don't do a ton of deep work. The thing that's really killing us is interruptive thinking. The thing that's really hard for our brain is I have to continually context switch from one thing to another. So while I'm trying to answer this issue about book formatting, I also have to check my inbox and see there's an unrelated issue going on about marketing. And then I try to answer that. And then I see there's a text from my friend, so I try to answer that. It's actually this rapid shifting of context. That's the thing that really is making us exhausted and unhappy. So you could have a day in which there's a lot of different things you do, none of which you might describe as deep, right? So nothing is, I'm sitting here writing a book. Maybe they're all like relatively logistical. If you're able to do those one by one, and while you're working on one, you're not context shifting to anything else. You're not seeing anything else. You're not getting exposed to other tasks you're not doing. When you're done, you moved on to the next. That is going to feel much, much better than a day in which you blend those all together and you're communicating about all of those simultaneously while you're trying to execute them. So really the sequentiality is much more aligned with what the human brain is comfortable doing.
Because I have to admit, I did have a WhatsApp chat open at the same time this morning talking about the Masters Golf, which is upcoming. That's probably part of the problem.
Yeah, well, see, it's and this is the issue, and this was one of the big observations in the new book, is that's what's making us unhappy. The reason deep work, for example, feels satisfying, it's not necessarily that humans are wired to write books, like to do really, really hard cognitive things. It's because when you are doing deep work, you're not context shifting all the time. And what you're getting away from is what we're not meant to do. So it's more the avoidance of what our brain can't handle well, which is checking an inbox, checking a WhatsApp, checking chat channels, all of this constantly while trying to do other things. That is incredibly artificial. And it makes us unhappy and exhausts our brain. It has all these other cognitive impacts. So anything that gets us away from that feels, relatively speaking, much better. So it's why when you're out, in your garden, or you're watching a sporting event without your phone or whatever it is, all that feels really good, in part just because we're avoiding this artificial behavior that actually feels much worse.
What's the research around it then? Because you're right about the exhaustion, that word exhaustion and exhausted. I went down for lunch at 1 o'clock, saw my other half who's working from home as well today. And like I say, it was nothing particularly deep in terms of the work that I was doing, but there were lots of different chats and different things going on. And I was constantly interrupting my stream of thought, and I felt utterly exhausted at lunchtime. And I just wonder whether there's been any research on the fatigue levels of kind of working like that.
We have research on this that goes back to the 1920s. The issue is network switching is expensive. So for our brain to switch its attention from one thing to another is a non-trivial process. It takes time and it takes energy. If you try to constantly initiate these type of network switches and then abort them and come back to what you're doing and then initiate them again, what happens when you're trying to, let's say, keep up with a WhatsApp conversation in your inbox while you're trying to write or work on something else? This constant partial network switching, the brain can't do that. That it's just something that the brain, you got to give it 10 minutes to switch over to something else, and then it can do that thing for a while. Then you got to give it 10 minutes to switch over to something else, and it can do that. If you try to constantly jump back and forth, we can't do that. Computer processors can do that. Computer processors are completely agnostic to the opcodes that it's executing. You just fill up a pipeline buffer, and it just goes cycle, execute. It doesn't care what the opcodes are. The human brain can't. It says, if you want to switch from the operation of writing to the operation of talking to my friends about the Masters on WhatsApp, I need 10 minutes. And if you don't give it that, if you're just trying to go back and forth, it's a cognitive train wreck. And that's why we get exhausted. Our ability to concentrate goes down, and we feel this background hum of anxiety build.
I mean, all of this makes so much sense to me. And I think it's especially relevant to my work as a journalist as well, because as a journalist, you have to be on top of all the different news sources at once, but I can still cut distractions. But despite knowing all this, I don't always put it into practice. So how can you help me on that?
Well, sometimes just knowing what it is you're trying to avoid makes a big difference, right? So if we go back to deep work, just giving a term to that type of effort really helped a lot of people. Not that they were going to do deep work all the time, but it helped people have a vocabulary. Oh, these type of efforts that are part of my job are different from these other ones, and I should make sure that I prioritize it. I think when it comes to the distractions, the inboxes, this sort of cognitive fatigue, understanding that network switching is the problem, that's the productivity poison, makes it much easier to actually improve, because now you know what to improve. I can't overemphasize the degree to which people's relationships with communication tools was very complicated and confusing. This is what I found when I was working on this research, because the tool is efficient and it's like better than other tools. And I don't want to call someone and leave a voicemail, and email is better than that. And that's how my work actually happens. But also I feel really bad about my inbox, and how would I work without it? And it's very confusing for people. If you recognize, no, the problem is email's fine. It's better than a fax machine. Context switching is bad. Network switching is bad. So what you're really trying to do here is it's not a game of I check my email less or send less email. You got to figure out, how do I change the underlying way that I work, how I collaborate with people, my systems, my rules, my guidelines, so that there's not so many of these unscheduled messages coming in that require me to answer. So if I'm having a lot of issues with my publisher, well, maybe what we need is a standing meeting that is incredibly efficient, and we keep track of in a shared document all the things coming up we need to discuss, and then we have this very efficient meeting where we work through a lot of issues, and it's 30 minutes a week as opposed to 30 emails a week, which can be 500 email checks to get to those 30 messages.
Yeah.
All of that type of thinking becomes clear once you realize, oh, this is the problem I'm trying to avoid. So it's a big part of my work is labeling things that people already intuitively know are good or bad, but can't quite get their arms around why. Give them a label, give them a definition, and then unleash people's inherent ability to innovate around those.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if some people are more prone to deep or losing their focus. Some people are just, I was looking over my old school reports recently, and some of them were just so damning of my levels of focus in class. And one teacher said, Tony is quite literally bone idle. which seemed rather unfair to write in a school report, because actually I'm not bone idle. I just don't think I was very good at focusing, and I think the style of lesson obviously wasn't keeping me very engaged. Because an adult, I'm very capable of kind of absorbing myself in one thing as long as it interests me. But are some people just hardwired to focus better, or do we all have to kind of learn this discipline?
Well, there's clearly a large range because we can look at the extremes. Right, so you go to one extreme of this range and you get into attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders, where it's sort of a diagnosable difficulty with maintaining focus in the presence of other stimuli. You go to the other extreme and you get some of the people I worked with when I was at the theory group at MIT who could stare at a whiteboard for 6 hours, and had won MacArthur Genius Grants in their teenage years. So you have these real extremes for sure. So we have different, wherever that comes from, we have different natural abilities to focus. And that being said, even with this big spread, we want to avoid the things that are devastating to that ability. So if we were in some sort of physical, like we're a military unit and there was some physical performance we cared about, like how fast we could run because it was part of our training, we might have a really large range of really naturally good runners and people who aren't great runners. But we don't want to put like a heavy rucksack on everyone if we could avoid it, because it's going to slow down everyone a ton and it's completely avoidable. I think that's what's going on here. So regardless of our natural ability to focus, exposing ourselves to these constant context shifts is really devastating.
Yeah. That's it. You're right. And just putting a label on it is going to mean that I focus on it a lot more after having spoken to you. What are some of the other things you've looked at in this kind of world without email that sounds very alluring? Zero inbox.
Well, so what you realize once you identify the problem is the context shifts. You realize the goal is not actually to get rid of email or to have a zero inbox. It's to get rid of a world in which you have a large number of these unscheduled messages that you have to respond to. That's the thing that really gets to us, is that if the main way we collaborate is through ad hoc back and forth messaging, there's going to be a lot of messages constantly showing up at unpredictable times that require relatively quick responses from you, because keeping that ping pong ball going back and forth across this metaphorical ping pong table net is how things actually get done. And so now you have to check things all the time and you get the network switching. When you realize that's the issue, you say, oh, the solution that is not my habits, it's not how I approach my inbox, it's not my schedule for checking email, it's not my subject lines, it's I have to actually put in place alternative ways to collaborate that don't require a lot of unscheduled back and forth messages. And that, I think, opens up the whole game, because up to now we've just been looking at ourselves and our habits and saying I'm bad at my inbox or I'm addicted to my email, and we're sort of seeing everything through this lens of personal productivity. But the reality is we have to go deeper. Forget the inbox. We have to get rid of the things that are generating all that messages going into the inbox in the first place. So now we have to start coming up with alternative systems and rules and guidelines for how we do the main collaboration that makes up our work. That's more structured, that's more intentional, and above all, generates many, many fewer of these unscheduled messages. So, once you know that's the issue, the type of solution you're looking at suddenly seems much different than where a lot of people who are overwhelmed with their inbox had been putting their energy.
And is that managing expectations with people as well?
Well, see, that can help, right? But again, I think I put expectations and norms and habits, all of this I put at the working with your inbox level. It's not going to get us there. It's not just expectations. It's no, here is how we collaborate about this. And it doesn't involve you just sending me a message when you're ready. So I don't want to just say, don't expect to hear back from me. I want to make it so that you don't have to hear back from me. That's where you really get to the magic, because the issue with this work, I call it the hyperactive hive mind, but the issue with this workflow where it's constantly ad hoc back and forth messages is it requires you to check these inboxes a lot, right? Because this is how things are being decided with these unstructured conversations. If you say, don't expect to hear back from me for, a day, you're going to grind all these conversations to a halt and it's going to be a problem. It's a real issue with the way we've been trying to solve this problem is if these messages are how we're actually doing our work, then any type of advice that tries to reduce the amount of time you interact with these messages actually has negative consequences. And that's why we always fail when we say, okay, let's have better norms or better expectations or email-free Fridays. Until you actually fix the fact that those emails is how work is getting done, any type of improvement that reduces your time in that inbox causes problems. That creates friction. You have to get back into it. So really the ultimate solutions to all of these is, actually, you know what? We generate this report every week. Right now, we just kind of shoot back and forth emails. Let's put in place a more structured way to do this that doesn't require those messages. And then let's repeat that for everything we do on a regular basis, alternative ways of collaborating that doesn't require unscheduled messages. That's how you take the pressure out of the hyperactive hive mind. And then the habits and the norms and the expectations, none of this really matters because you just don't have that pressure to need to check that inbox in the first place anymore.
Do you consult with businesses?
No, I don't. Well, A, I don't have time because I'm a professor and I write and I have a bunch of kids. And B, I like to, as I like to tell businesses, I do theory, okay, here's how the mind works, how information is moving through it, but I'm not a business person. So I can't come in and talk to you about your particular business processes because I don't know about your particular business processes, and I don't know about your quarterly report filings that you need to do or the complexity of your accounting. And so I've steered clear of sort of on the ground consulting. I said, let me introduce theory that people who are much better at business than me can take that theory and then figure out how to make real actual boots on the ground. If I came in and tried to change your company, you'd probably be out of business 6 months later. Because I'd be like, we don't need this. Like, wait a second, that's how we report all of our financial earnings. And you would not want me in there turning the levers.
Well, that's very noble of you because your personal bank balance would probably be larger, but that's so it's a good thing you're doing. It's interesting listening to you talking about a world without email because I know I'm not sure in America if WhatsApp is quite as big as it is here. But WhatsApp is how we all communicate here all the time. And I'm obviously talking for me and my friends, but this is on a personal level, not a work or business level. But there's definitely the similar kind of stress now around WhatsApps that it's so relentless. It's so 24 hours. And sometimes if you go a day without answering your WhatsApps, you'll have 10, 15 messages or groups that need attention. It's quite a stressful undertaking. And of course, it's not even related to work. There are similarities though, aren't there?
Well, so we saw this issue emerge first, I think, with teenagers, right? So when teenagers got their hands on smartphones, they invented this hypercommunicative culture in which they were constantly communicating. This was happening maybe around the second decade of the 21st century. So starting around 2010 to 2012, we began to have this first generation of teenagers that had relatively easily access to things like iPhones. And they began communicating all the time, like all they were doing all the time. And no one had really done this before. These were the innovators in this type of communication. And we saw a big spike in anxiety in exactly that cohort because the brain can't do all this context switching. It can't also handle socialization all the time. It needs downtime because it's very expensive for the brain to actually do social interactions. WhatsApp, iMessage, a few other tools have basically now expanded this hypercommunicative type of behavior to many more demographic cohorts, including just sort of adults in general, a lot of people. It is a problem. It is incompatible with our brain to keep a constant parallel series of conversations going on with people throughout all of your waking hours. Our brain just can't do that well. It's going to significantly decrease your ability to think clearly. It's going to lead to mental exhaustion. It is going to cause anxiety. Our brain can't do that. It's like saying, I don't want to sleep anymore. That seems inconvenient. And evolution is saying, too bad. Like humans need to sleep. Well, it's something similar here too. And I think I talk about this sometimes on my podcast. WhatsApp in particular comes up a lot. You essentially have to transform yourself into a different type of WhatsApp participant, the participant that has sometimes they're there, but most of the times they're not. And, at first that means you're getting all these messages, where are you? And then you're getting a little bit fewer messages, where are you? And then you get the, he's just not great at WhatsApp. And then you have freedom. And it's a little bit of a painful thing, and you can still use it. Yeah. But it's more like people learn, Tony might log into this in the evening at some point and spend a half hour catching up on conversations and seeing what's going on. But we no longer have an expectation that if we send him a message right now that he will respond right away. People have to go through that transformation. I just don't think it's not a viable long-term way to live to have this constant communication.
No. And the whole thing is just getting more and more all-pervasive. And not even just WhatsApp, but all levels of technology. I mean, probably... When did deep work come out?
2016.
2016. Well, but before that, I started trying to switch off all technology for at least 2 hours a day. And it was always, invariably, the best 2 hours of the day, every single time. I've got all the things done that I really enjoy. And then some things that I don't rate amongst my kind of best things to do in the world, but I just seem to enjoy a lot more when I wasn't surrounded by technology, things like cleaning the house, for example. But now I found it harder and harder to switch off. If I'm going to drive to work, I now use Waze, and I need to be connected for that. And there's so many different ways that you need to be connected now, which you didn't in the past.
And there's so many more ways that we have made it necessary to be connected because of decisions we made about how we want to live or work that aren't set in stone. I think what we need in general is this return of intention. So in the world of non-work, in the world of interacting with our phones outside of work, I wrote this book in 2019, Digital Minimalism, that got into that. And it basically
I've got that here, yes.
But the big point there was, if you're not intentional about, I'm using this tool to do this thing I care about, and therefore here are the rules on how I use it. If you don't go through that thought process, you get completely overwhelmed. Same thing happened in the world of work. It's like, well, we have email, we have Slack now, like let's just rock and roll and get things done without careful intention. How do we actually want to work? What's going to be best for our brains? What's going to be much more sustainable? We get completely overwhelmed. So I think this happens again and again with these technologies. Is they're powerful enough now? They have big enough effects because of the power, their reach. They're hooked up to worldwide networks and really powerful computers. And it's a technology of a level of potential impact that's so large that in general, the new innovations of the last 10 or 15 years, if we just casually bring them into our lives or our offices and say, this seems useful, let's just try it, it is like a tsunami wave that completely overwhelms us and overwhelms our life. And so we're just starting to get back up after that first wave and say, okay, this stuff is not so exciting anymore. We're past the exuberance portion of the innovation cycle. We're used to smartphones. We're used to the global internet. We're used to email. Great. Let's start actually making some hard decisions about how we want to use this, and more importantly, how we don't. We're just now starting to figure that out, but we have to, because what we've noticed is we just get knocked down again and again when we let our guard down.
Yeah. And then, of course, you mentioned how there is a generation that has grown up with, I can't remember the word used, was it hyperconnectivity?
Yeah, or hypercommunicativity, like constant communication. Yeah.
Yeah. And you also mentioned that you've got a family, and I've got a 2-year-old, and we've talked quite a bit about healthy ways to use technology around him and bring him up around technology. I wonder how you put all this into practice with your family.
Well, I think demonstration is critical. What they see is something they're going to internalize. So if they see their parents always on their phone, it's going to internalize what their relationship with technology might be, which is why I'm a big preacher of what I call the phone foyer method, where your phone is by the front door. It's in the foyer. It's where you plug it in. If you need to look something up, you go to your phone. If you're expecting a call, you turn the ringer on. It's not with you by default in the house. Like that is something I think is a big deal because young people see it. I also think we're going to see a shift. I mean, this is just a prediction, but I think within about 5 years or so, we're going to see a cultural shift in which it's going to be deemed increasingly inappropriate for, let's say, a young adolescent to have access to a smartphone. That seeing a 15-year-old with a smartphone will be how seeing perhaps a 15-year-old with a cigarette suddenly became something that was really socially inappropriate at some point during whenever this was, the 1960s or 1970s. I think we'll probably see something like that happen with adolescents. So by the time our kids are of that age, we probably will have a lot less work to do because we're not unlucky enough to be the first generation to have kids to have access to this. We'll be able to learn from what came before. So I think that's important as well. If I had a 15-year-old kid right now, they would not have a smartphone. I just think both the research, but also just the anecdotal self-reporting of young people, it is a really large sort of negative impact in their lives.
Yeah. But I have to say, it's a lot younger than 15 that most of my friends say, if they don't give them a smartphone, they're the only one in the class without it.
But isn't that the universal argument of kids on everything ever that they've wanted to do? that parents don't want them? Has there ever been anything where they didn't say, but everyone else does it? And the reality of that, by the way, is you don't need most people in a class not using a smartphone for that to become socially acceptable. You need 2 people. Right. This is the sort of positive deviance theory that we're closer to this tipping point. A lot of teenagers don't like it. They feel like they're chained down to these things. It's a source of anxiety. It's a source of stress. If you have just a few people in a particular community, like a school community, who proudly do not use these things, it validates that as an option.
Yeah. And
now all the teenagers are like, this is really causing more stress than it is causing me benefits. Now you have the social cover to do it. So then you get this really large cascading effect of fewer and fewer people doing something. So I think we're actually closer. Shifting that culture is probably a lot closer than we realize, because we think, oh, we would have to make it so no one's using their phone before it's acceptable for my daughter not to use it. It's like, no, as long as there's a handful of people not using it, it becomes a socially acceptable option.
Yeah. Well, if for nothing else, I'm so pleased that we've spoken today, because I did slightly inwardly shudder when you were talking about the, setting an example part of using a phone around children. And the foyer idea is an excellent idea. And if I'm honest with myself, whilst I kind of pride myself that we, don't really have many screens on around the house and I'm pretty good, actually, it probably does seep into everyday life quite a bit, using my phone around my 2-year-old, who's just too young to really be bothered by it, but he's soaking it all up, isn't he? So I need to set a good example.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Like the things we do now, it's not going to change what they do when they're teenagers because we have no control on them, but it's going to affect them when they're 25. Like that's the way I always think about parenting. You set the example of how you want them to live when they get to their 20s. You're going to lose all control when they're a teenager anyways, but it's when they come back to adulthood, what was it they learned by watching you?
Which is a terrifying prospect.
I hear you.
Yeah. Well, look, I've just learned so much and really enjoyed talking to you, Cal. The two questions that I ask everybody is, what is one tip that you have for living with more energy? And what is one book that's had a big impact on you and that you would recommend?
Well, when it comes to books, I might recommend, there's a book by Lewis Mumford with the very exciting and marketable title, Technics and Civilization. Okay. But it was actually like a really influential book that came out earlier in the 20th century that helped set the scholarly agenda around the idea that technologies can have these unpredictable, unintentional, but really impactful impacts on how humans live and behave, right? That you introduce a technology for reason X and it changes Y. And that we can really look at economic history through sort of unexpected consequences of new technological introductions. That was a really important book for me, and I think it's a really important frame for trying to understand technology in your own life. We tend to be very instrumentalist sometimes, where we think about technologies as very neutral, and then it's just a matter of, am I using them right or wrong? This way of thinking, which is called technological determinism, says there's more to that. You introduce a new technology into an ecosystem, it changes the whole ecosystem. You put email into an office, it's not just, oh, now I have this extra option for sending information quicker. The whole way we collaborate changes, and no one plans it, and it's not intentional, right? So it's a really readable, interesting book that was the foundation, for a lot of thinking. And then in terms of a tip for having more sort of energy in life, I'm an increasing proponent of doing less. I mean, I think we just do too much. Having more than enough time to get done the things that are on your plate is a state that is really rare right now, but is a state that is much more compatible with our mind. I think the goal setting and plan execution portions of our brain get completely overloaded when we have like so many more things on our plate than we can really even conceive getting done. That is something that the Paleolithic brain isn't good at, just like, our brain wants us to eat sugar because we have that program, but we didn't have candy back then. And so if we give ourselves a ton of candy, it overloads the circuits. I think our execution planning circuits get overloaded when we overload ourselves and our schedule. So I've increasingly been interested in this idea of doing less as a strategy for actually getting a lot more out of your day to day.
And do you, I think I've got your planner somewhere. Do you kind of plan your day to make sure that you do less? So it's like, okay, well, I'll do the deep work between 10 to 1. I'll check my emails between 1 and 1:30, and then it's doing less time.
Yeah, I time block plan with that time block planner because I want to get, when I'm working, so I want to get the most out of this time possible. I find when you approach work more haphazardly, like what do I want to do next? What's in my inbox? You just waste a lot of energy cycles. I'd rather work for 5 hours really intentionally and get done this, and just the right way. So then I can be done, whereas I could probably, that same amount of work might take me 8 or 9 hours if I was being more casual about it. So for me, the planner is not about reducing the things I do, but reducing the time required to get done the things I have to do.
Yeah. There's a surf company in the UK, and they put all their staff, I think they've got about 60 members of staff, they put them all on a 5-hour day between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. and then they could all go off and go surfing. I think they're in Cornwall. And they said productivity went up and they were all loads happier as well. And they got everything done in the 5 hours.
Yeah. Well, there's a company like that I talked about in the new book, but I also wrote a New York Times op-ed about this company maybe last year. They also do the same thing, 5 hours. They're based in Germany.
Yeah.
You know what the thing is they had to do? That's the CEO told me this. To make that work, they had to retrain the employees around things like email and meetings, because they basically we have to get rid of this culture where we just figure things out via email or set meetings. That was the number one thing that was getting in the way of short work days. If you could put in alternative ways of collaborating, some more rules and systems, so we weren't just shooting emails back and forth, we weren't just setting up meetings every time anyone had an issue or a question, suddenly that 5-hour workday was more than enough. So I thought that was really interesting to hear from him. Those were the two things that are taking up so much time in our day. So it's like with modern technology, we could be working much less.
Yeah.
Except for we introduced these other things because of the technology, this sort of highly distractive, low cognitive utilization type back and forth communication and meetings that just ate up the extra time we gained from this tech. So get rid of that stuff eating up the extra time. More of us could be like that surf shop. I think more of us probably should be.
Oh, definitely. Cal, thank you so much. Really great to talk to you. So your new book is A World Without Email.
That's right. Yep.
And obviously, I love the other ones as well. And I was just looking over some of the things that I'd highlighted in your old books. And one of the things you'd written, I think in Deep Work, is how much you hated receiving emails with one word, basically saying thoughts, ? And then the rest, and then a big kind of chain underneath, which you were expected to expand on at length underneath.
Yeah, I think that's in the revised version of Dante. In the Divine Comedy, in that first book, there's another circle of hell, and I think it's people that CC thoughts to 25 people on a chain of 17 emails. It's each one indenting more and more. Yeah. I think that's like the third circle of hell now is how that works.
Yeah, and I think I've got a very bad habit as well, which is when I don't have enough time to send a long WhatsApp message, I'll record a voice message instead, which is just such bad form. It's not really, it's not very good WhatsApp etiquette, I don't think, because then it takes, a minute and a half for somebody to listen to the message. So I need to stop doing that.
I know. It's a quick thing. Asymmetries, I think, is a really big deal. So I wrote this article a couple of weeks ago that got spread around where I said, what we should do for meetings is make the cost way more asymmetric. So everyone has set times where they're available each week, like an hour here, 2 hours here, whatever, right? If you want to get together 6 people for a meeting, you no longer can bring all 6 of those people together to you to spend an hour of their time in a meeting. You have to go to each of them one by one during their pre-scheduled office hours. I call them reverse meetings. So in other words, you make the cost higher for the person who needs the meeting and much lower for everyone else. And I figured, all right, not only would that save time, I bet it would cut the number of meetings by a factor of 5, because all it takes sometimes is like a little bit of friction before people are like, you know what, never mind. It's not that important.
Great. Cal, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
That's it for today's podcast. Thank you for listening. I hope you like the new podcast format. Do let me know your thoughts on that one. You can go to tonywrighton.com/voicemail, or you can just send me an email through tonywrighton.com and just let me know what you think. A bit of a new format. The thing is, the great pleasure in doing this podcast for me is that I just do all this stuff anyway. I cook rice and I cool it. I follow all the tips and tricks that Cal Newport is into. I'm, so deep in this world. I'm such a sad geek that I love talking about it on this podcast, and therefore I suppose after 7 years of doing it, I want to include a little bit more of me. That's the idea. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.